Joining me now is Kurtis Andrews. He's a lawyer out of Ottawa, Ontario. And Kurtis, this week you published an open letter voicing some frustration, to use the word mildly, about sort of the state of convicting those that have trespassed and have, in the name of animal rights, gone into people's farms and their homes. Bring us up to speed. What sort of spurred this letter?
Sure. Well, first, to be clear, it appears that these are decisions being made by those working at the Crown Attorney's Office in various jurisdictions. And they have certain discretion to pursue or not pursue the prosecution of cases, and they practice that discretion in different ways. But what's happened recently here in Ontario is in more than one case, they have elected to withdraw charges or in some cases, on a guilty plea, require no penalty. In cases where animal rights activists have gone into barns, broken into barns, videotaped in certain situations, taken an animal in other situations. And I mean, to me, it's just so clear that they have broken the law. They are videotaping their exploits, and they're boasting about it on social media. They're encouraging other people to take up the cause and do the same thing. And they're not being prosecuted, and they're not being punished, and that's providing no deterrence. And as a result, farmers are not being protected by the law or the authorities. And again, to be perfectly clear, that it appears that the police are on side in terms of investigating, and the charges are being laid, but it's at the Crown Attorney's Office that the charges are being dropped, or there's no penalty sought.
Mm-hmm. So to catch some people up, the latest case was one where someone went into a pork farm and stole an animal. There's also, of course, mink farms here in Ontario have often been in the news about animal rights activists going in and, quote unquote, releasing these animals, which of course then leads to mass die-offs often of the young mink. And then, of course, just recently, over the weekend, a few weeks ago, there were several dairy farms one dairy farm where the people did walk into the farm and as far as I understand it, actually took a dead calf and removed it from the property. I know also that last weekend, there were some in the farming community who received an email from their producer group to say that there was an animal rights group setting up shop in their area and that the person poses as a seed sales rep to gain entrance into farms. So, I mean, it seems to me, and as a livestock producer myself, it definitely does seem to feel like the pressure is definitely on from some of these people, that they seem to be, they're well coordinated, they're highly motivated, and to your point of there being no punishment and no prosecution on these things, where does that leave our farmers as far as exposure?
Well, they're seriously at risk, and they're not, like I said, they're not being protected the way they should be. I don't think, again, some of these are my personal opinion, but I don't think they're being respected by those people that are making decisions to drop these charges. I can't speak for the reasons, because unfortunately, when these charges are dropped, the reasons are always the same vague statement of no reasonable prospect for conviction. But frankly, when you've got the evidence that we have, that everybody can see, I don't see how there isn't a reasonable prospect of conviction. So there are reasons. We don't know what they are. But like I said, I don't think that farmers are being respected. I don't think they're being treated properly as the victims in these cases. And again, to your point, this is leaving them, highly vulnerable. Our farmers are in rural areas. Their neighbors are some distance away. The police are going to be some distance away. And I think that they're extremely vulnerable and at risk to these actions. And I don't think it should be tolerated. And the only way to deter it is to have meaningful punishment for what they're doing.
Yeah. So one of my questions, and certainly one of the discussions that, a couple weeks ago when there were trespassers in a dairy barn and on a dairy farm, there are questions about, what should you do if they're parked out on the roadside or entering your farm. I guess my question from the law's perspective, what laws are being broken when an animal rights activist enters your farm?
Well, certainly they are trespassing to begin with. We have provincial trespass laws to protect people from anybody, doesn't matter if they're a farm or not, from trespassing. If they are breaking into your barn, it's break and enter. If they are, in some manner interfering with the use of your property, that could be considered mischief. There are, and if they're stealing things, there's theft. And in that peculiar case involving the dairy farm where a dead calf was taken, that's contrary to the province's Dead Animal Disposal Act. There's a host of biosecurity issues here as well. I think CFIA should be concerned on top of everybody else from a public interest standpoint. So there are a variety of laws that are being broken. It all depends on the particular circumstances of the case, but certainly laws are being broken. There's just no question about it.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And as you mentioned, often these are videotaped or I guess that's sort of an archaic term, but recorded, photos posted on social media. There's calls to action. I mean, these are organizations that have strong social media presence, groups on Facebook, that sort of stuff. There is, as I mentioned, there was last week an email that went out to producers and these sorts of discussions from the side of farmers definitely need to happen, but we also need to be cognizant that sharing that information should happen widely, but also privately. Because as a livestock producer myself, I mean, we already, I will say that I already feel exposed, let's say, in that, we have frontage on a major road and you can see our livestock. But that, sharing these things publicly, let's say on social media to say that there are activists in the area or those sorts of things, it could potentially put more people at risk in that, these organizations could be compiling lists of names or people involved or where your farm is, those sorts of things. So that's certainly one of my fears. And I will certainly say that, as you've mentioned, the fact that there are all these rules or laws being broken, but absolutely no conviction or following through, and cases are being dropped before they even go anywhere is mind-boggling to me. I mean, that's opinion side, but very much. So I suppose the next question really is, where would you like to see things move, and how important is it, do you think, that we get some respect and some understanding of where farmers are at in this?
Well, I mean, you've raised a number of points there, so I'll try to respond if I can to each one of them. So to begin with, these cases need to be taken more seriously, and they need to be prosecuted. They need to be prosecuted with a level of vigor that's going to result in meaningful penalties. That's to begin with. If there's an issue with the laws being too difficult to prosecute, just in how the law happens to be written, if that is the case, then there needs to be some changes to the law, because this can't be tolerated. People cannot be put at risk like this, and people cannot be left this vulnerable. People should not be expected to live in fear. And so you talk about, being careful to try and keep your head down and not attract attention. Well, first of all, the activists are compiling lists already, no matter what you do. So they're doing that. I have a really hard time with people having to change their conduct, their social interactions, their presence in the public sphere. I have a real problem with people having to change those things out of fear caused by other people. Again, just my opinion, but I think that we should be protected from this kind of activity, and we shouldn't have to change how we live our lives, as a way to supposedly protect ourselves. Now, having said that, there are certain things that you probably could do to protect yourself in your property. It's going to involve fences. It's going to involve gates. I know people in rural areas that does not sit well with their openness with their neighbors, and being free to have people visit them. But unfortunately, those sorts of precautions probably do need to be taken. So there's a variety of things that you need to consider. In getting back to your point about your presence out there in terms of attracting attention and so on. Yes, indeed. There are, I would say not, again, I have a real problem with having to change how you interact socially and so on. But at the same time, there are certain precautions that you can take that wouldn't necessarily unduly restrict what you're already doing. And so, for example, avoid having your address out there available on social media, or any other information that your friends are going to know anyways, but people who are not your friends, you want to keep that information from them. So we're jumping around a little bit. There's a lot of issues at play here, but those are just some thoughts on things.
Mm-hmm. And I agree with you. I mean, it seems like when you're on the correct side or the right side of the law, you shouldn't have to worry about these things. But, from a personal perspective, knowing that, these activists don't face any sort of penalty, I don't really see where the law is protecting me. So I'm going to take care of myself, right?
Yes, and you've identified, I think, maybe the crux of it right there. So you're now forced to have to take things almost into your own hands in order to protect yourself. But that's not how it's supposed to work.
No, and I don't want that. And I don't think as a society that's what we want either. No, absolutely.
And other people in their homes, the average person sitting at home, they don't live in fear of people barging in their front door. They don't live in fear of people in their backyard all of a sudden. They don't live with those fears that farmers are now having to live with. And I don't believe for a second that if people were forcing their way into people's homes and forcing their way into people's backyards and refusing to leave, I can't believe that they would not be prosecuted with the full weight of the law. I just can't believe that would happen. And this is why I feel that farmers are not being respected adequately in having these cases dealt with.
Absolutely. All right, Kurtis Andrews, thank you so much for your time today.